You're nothing but a disappointment, Natalie. I'm proud of all my children except the pathetic loser. Those words echoed through the Sterling family mansion as I calmly reached into my purse. What my father Harrison didn't know was that I held the key to destroying his perfect family image forever. By the end of the night, the luxury Mercedes I'd bought him would be gone, and 32 years of lies would finally come crashing down. I'm Natalie Sterling, and despite building a groundbreaking career on Wall Street, I've spent my entire life chasing approval from a man who was never truly my father. The DNA test results in my purse proved it, but what happened next would shake our prestigious Westfield family to its core. Growing up in the shadow of Westfield's rolling hills, the Sterling name carried weight in every country club and boardroom across Connecticut. Our colonial mansion sat on 5 manicured acres, a testament to my father Harrison's rise from modest beginnings to real estate empire. The property itself was a monument to his success. Imported marble in the foyer, crystal chandeliers that had belonged to some European aristocrat, Persian rugs that cost more than most people's cars. Every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that required a full-time staff to maintain. But behind the pristine facade, our family operated like a corporation with Harrison as the unforgiving CEO, and I was the underperforming employee he couldn't quite fire. The house that looked like paradise from the outside was actually a carefully constructed stage where each of us performed our assigned roles under his constant scrutiny. From my earliest memories, Harrison Sterling was never the father who cheered at soccer games or helped with science projects. He was the relentless critic who transformed my A- into evidence of mediocrity, who questioned why I wasn't valedictorian when I graduated second in my class, who reminded me that almost perfect was just another word for failure. Every achievement became a stepping stone to his next impossible expectation. The pattern started early. So early that I can barely remember a time when I didn't feel like I was auditioning for his approval. When I brought home my first report card in elementary school, straight A's except for 1 A- in art, Harrison's response wasn't celebration, but interrogation. Why couldn't you get a perfect score in art, Natalie? It's not even a real subject. While other parents displayed their children's artwork on refrigerators, Harrison would examine my crayon drawings with the same critical eye he used to evaluate property investments, always finding flaws that needed correction. I remember standing in our kitchen, proud of the butterfly I'd painted in watercolors, watching his face as he studied it with the intensity of an art critic examining a potential forgery. "The proportions are off," he said finally, pointing to the wings, "and the color choices are unrealistic. Butterflies don't typically have these color combinations." I was 7 years old, but I felt the familiar sting of not being good enough, the crushing weight of disappointing someone whose approval meant everything to me. That butterfly painting became a metaphor for my childhood. No matter how beautiful I thought something was, Harrison could always find the flaws, the imperfections, the ways it could be improved. He had a gift for taking joy and transforming it into a lesson about inadequacy. What should have been a proud moment between father and daughter became another teaching opportunity about the importance of attention to detail and realistic expectations. The kitchen where this conversation took place was enormous, with granite countertops and professional-grade appliances that Isabella used to prepare elaborate meals for Harrison's business associates. But it was also where I learned that my perspective didn't matter, that my childish delight in creating something beautiful was less important than adhering to adult standards of accuracy and realism. During middle school, when I made honor roll every semester, he'd compare my grades to my brother Derek's, always finding ways to diminish my accomplishments. "Derek managed to get straight A's while playing 3 sports," he'd say, as if my academic success was somehow less meaningful because it came through focused study rather than natural talent. The implication was always clear. I had to work harder to achieve what others accomplished effortlessly, and that effort itself was evidence of inferiority. The comparison became a constant soundtrack to my childhood. At the dinner table, he'd casually mention how Derek had scored the winning goal in lacrosse while also maintaining perfect attendance in all his classes. Time management, he'd say with a meaningful look in my direction. The key to success is learning to excel in multiple areas simultaneously. Never mind that I was already juggling advanced mathematics, debate team, and volunteer work at the local hospital. My achievements were always measured against Derek's, and somehow I always came up short. These dinner conversations became exercises in psychological warfare, though I wouldn't recognize them as such until much later. Harrison would orchestrate them with the skill of a master manipulator, introducing topics that would highlight my shortcomings while emphasizing Derek's strengths. If I mentioned a good grade on a test, he'd immediately pivot to discussing Derek's recent athletic achievements. If I shared excitement about a debate competition I'd won, he'd wonder aloud why I wasn't also participating in more social activities like Derek. The dining room itself was another stage for these performances. We ate at a mahogany table that seated 12, using china that had been in Isabella's family for generations. The formality of the setting reinforced the sense that every meal was a business meeting where my performance was being evaluated. I learned to monitor Harrison's expressions, to gauge his mood before speaking, to calculate whether sharing good news would result in praise or criticism. High school brought new opportunities for disappointment. I was accepted to Princeton on a full academic scholarship, but Harrison's response was immediate criticism. "Why didn't you apply to Yale? That's where sterling men have always gone. Are you deliberately trying to reject family tradition?" The fact that I'd earned a full ride to an Ivy League school through merit was overshadowed by his interpretation of my choice as personal rebellion rather than academic achievement. I remember the night the acceptance letter arrived, how my hands trembled as I opened it in the kitchen while my family finished dinner. The words, "Congratulations and full scholarship," seemed to glow on the page, and for a moment I felt pure joy. This was it, I thought. This was the achievement that would finally make him proud. I walked into the dining room with the letter in my hand, my heart pounding with anticipation. "I got into Princeton," I announced, trying to keep my voice steady despite the excitement threatening to bubble over. "With a full academic scholarship." The table fell silent. Derek looked up from his dessert with genuine surprise and what might have been respect. Camila clapped her hands together with delight. My mother Isabella smiled warmly, her eyes brightening with pride. But Harrison's face remained impassive as he carefully set down his fork and extended his hand for the letter. He read it with the same methodical attention he gave to business contracts, his expression revealing nothing. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the praise that never came. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, marking seconds that felt like hours. "Princeton is a fine institution," he said finally, his tone suggesting this was somehow faint praise. "Though I'm surprised you didn't apply to Yale. Sterling men have been attending Yale for 3 generations. It's disappointing that you chose to break with family tradition." The words hit me like a physical blow. In all my fantasies about this moment, I'd never imagined that my greatest academic achievement would be framed as a disappointment, a betrayal of family legacy. The scholarship, the recognition of my intellectual capabilities, the validation of 4 years of relentless studying, all of it was erased by his focus on what I hadn't done rather than what I had accomplished. "I thought you'd be proud," I said quietly, my voice barely audible above the sound of my own heartbeat. "It's a full scholarship, Dad. They're paying for everything." Harrison's expression softened slightly, but not with warmth. Instead, he looked at me with the patient condescension he reserved for explaining obvious truths to those too naive to understand them. "Of course, I'm proud of your academic achievement, Natalie, but pride must be tempered with wisdom. What good is a scholarship if it takes you away from the connections and traditions that will serve you throughout your life?" He folded the letter carefully and handed it back to me. "I suppose it's too late to change your mind, but I hope you'll at least consider transferring to Yale after your first year. Sometimes we must correct our mistakes when we recognize them." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Harrison explaining the various ways my choice would limit my future opportunities. He talked about the Yale Alumni Network, the connections I'd be missing, the family disappointment my decision would cause. By the end, what should have been a celebration of my achievement had become a lecture about my poor judgment and short-sighted thinking. My mother Isabella was his perfect complement in public, the gracious hostess who could charm any room with her effortless elegance and carefully cultivated warmth. She moved through social gatherings like a skilled diplomat, remembering names, asking about children, making everyone feel valued and important. Her laugh was musical, her smile genuine, and her ability to make conversation flow naturally was legendary among Westfield's social elite. At charity galas and country club events, she was magnificent. I watched her work rooms with the skill of a seasoned politician, connecting with the wives of Harrison's business associates, remembering details about their children's achievements, their recent travels, their charitable interests. She had an almost supernatural ability to make each person feel like the most important individual in the room, and I admired her social grace even as I struggled to understand the woman she became at home. Isabella's public persona was a work of art, carefully constructed over decades of practice. She knew exactly which questions to ask to make people feel heard, which compliments would be most meaningful, which topics would engage each person's interests. At the annual hospital charity auction, she could discuss art with the museum donors, gardening with the horticulture enthusiasts, and travel with the worldly sophisticates, seamlessly transitioning between subjects with the skill of a master conversationalist. But privately, she transformed into something smaller, more fragile, her confident voice becoming hesitant whenever Harrison entered the room. I watched her shrink for decades, her eyes darting to him for approval before expressing the simplest opinion. It was a dynamic that confused me as a child, but would later reveal itself as the foundation of our family's dysfunction. The transformation was most noticeable during dinner conversations. When Harrison was traveling or working late, Isabella would engage with us children naturally, asking about our days, offering advice, sharing stories from her own childhood. She'd tell us about growing up in Boston, about her college years studying art history, about the dreams she'd had before marriage and motherhood reshaped her priorities. In these moments, she seemed like a different person entirely, animated, opinionated, intellectually curious. During these precious evenings when Harrison was absent, Isabella would become the mother I'd always wished for. She'd help with homework without criticizing my methods, listen to my concerns about friends without offering unsolicited advice, and share stories about her own struggles with perfectionism and self-doubt. She'd talk about the paintings she'd wanted to create, the trips she'd dreamed of taking, the books she'd hoped to write. "I wanted to be an art historian," she told me one evening as we worked together on a history project. I had this romantic notion that I'd spend my life traveling to museums around the world, studying masterpieces, writing about the stories behind great works of art. Her voice carried a wistfulness that I'd never heard before, a longing for the life she'd imagined before reality intervened. But the moment we heard his key in the front door, she'd change. Her voice would become more measured, her opinions more tentative, her attention divided between us and the invisible radar that tracked his mood and expectations. It was as if she'd lost the ability to have independent thoughts in his presence, every opinion filtered through his anticipated judgment. "What do you think about Natalie's idea to join the debate team?" she might ask, but her eyes would be on Harrison, gauging his reaction before forming her own response. If he showed interest, she'd become enthusiastic. If he seemed dismissive, she'd quickly pivot to safer topics. It was as if she'd absorbed his preferences so completely that she'd forgotten how to have her own. I began to notice how she'd edit herself in real time during conversations. She'd start to express an opinion, then catch herself mid-sentence, her eyes flicking to Harrison before rephrasing her thoughts in ways that aligned with his known preferences. If she began to disagree with something he'd said, she'd quickly backtrack, finding ways to reframe her perspective as merely expanding on his wisdom rather than challenging it. The pattern was most painful to watch when it came to discussions about us children. In private, she'd express concern about Harrison's criticism of my efforts, worrying that he was being too harsh, but in his presence she'd nod along with his assessments, even adding her own observations that supported his critiques. "Your father is right about the importance of time management," she'd say, her voice carrying none of the warmth she'd shown in private conversations. I began to understand that Isabella lived in a constant state of performance anxiety, never knowing when she might inadvertently trigger Harrison's disapproval. She'd developed an elaborate system of behavioral modifications designed to maintain harmony, but the cost was her own authentic self. She'd become so skilled at anticipating his reactions that she'd lost touch with her own thoughts and feelings. My older brother Derek seemed to navigate Harrison's expectations with supernatural ease. 3 years my senior, Derek embodied everything our father valued: athletic achievement, social connections, academic success that appeared effortless. He played varsity lacrosse with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world, dated the daughters of prominent families with the same natural ease he displayed in every other aspect of his life. Derek possessed an intuitive understanding of what would please our father. While I constantly guessed wrong, my efforts met with criticism disguised as guidance. When I joined the math team, Harrison questioned why I wasn't pursuing more social activities. When I tried out for drama club, he worried I was becoming too focused on frivolous pursuits. Nothing I chose seemed to strike the right balance between academic achievement and social development that Derek managed effortlessly. But Derek's success wasn't just academic or athletic. It was social in ways that I could never replicate. He had a natural charisma that drew people to him, an easy confidence that made teachers favor him and classmates seek his friendship. At family gatherings, he could engage with Harrison's business associates as if he'd been networking for years, discussing market trends and investment opportunities with the casual expertise of someone much older. I watched him during these conversations with a mixture of admiration and envy. Derek would lean back in his chair, completely at ease, offering opinions that Harrison would nod at approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that will serve you well in business," Harrison would say, his voice carrying the warmth I'd spent years trying to earn. "You understand that success requires both analytical skills and social intelligence." Derek had inherited Harrison's natural confidence, his ability to command attention without appearing to try. When he entered a room, people noticed. When he spoke, people listened. When he made jokes, people laughed. It was as if he'd been born with some secret knowledge about how to navigate the world that I'd never received. The difference between Derek and me was most apparent during family vacations. While I would spend hours researching historical sites and cultural attractions, Derek would immediately identify the best restaurants, the most exclusive clubs, the people worth meeting. He had an instinct for social hierarchies that I completely lacked, an ability to identify and connect with influential people that seemed almost supernatural. During one memorable trip to Martha's Vineyard, Derek spent the first day on the beach and returned with invitations to 3 private parties, connections to 2 influential families, and a standing invitation to play golf at an exclusive club. Meanwhile, I'd spent the same day reading about local history and visiting museums, activities that Harrison dismissed as typical tourist behavior. The difference in treatment was most apparent during our various ceremonies and celebrations. When Derek graduated high school, Harrison threw a party that included business associates, family friends, and half the country club membership. The house was filled with congratulations, gifts, and speeches about Derek's bright future. Catering staff circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, a band played on the terrace, and Harrison gave a toast that lasted nearly 10 minutes, detailing Derek's accomplishments and predicting his continued success. When my turn came 2 years later, despite graduating as valedictorian, the celebration was significantly smaller, more restrained, with Harrison's toast focusing on the importance of remaining humble despite academic success. "Achievement is meaningless without character," he said, raising his glass with considerably less enthusiasm than he'd shown for Derek. "We must remember that true success comes from serving others, not from personal recognition." The implication was clear. My academic achievement was somehow suspect, tainted by ambition or ego in ways that Derek's athletic and social success was not. Even my moment of triumph was reframed as a cautionary tale about the dangers of intellectual pride. The guest list for my graduation party was telling. Where Derek's celebration had included his teammates, classmates, and teachers, mine was limited to immediate family and a few of Harrison's business associates who attended out of obligation rather than genuine interest. The conversation centered on my future plans, with Harrison steering the discussion toward the importance of choosing the right career path and maintaining proper priorities. My younger sister Camila, 2 years behind me, somehow managed to thread the needle of Harrison's approval system with natural charm and emotional intelligence. She wasn't the overachiever that Derek was, but she had an almost supernatural ability to read the room, to know when to speak and when to fade into the background. She became our family's emotional mediator, the one who could occasionally coax a smile from Harrison when his mood darkened. Camila had a gift for diffusing tension that I envied desperately. When Harrison's criticism of my performance in some area became particularly harsh, she would slip into the conversation with perfectly timed observations that redirected his attention without directly challenging his authority. She might mention a funny story from school, or ask his opinion on some current event, or simply compliment him on something that would shift his focus away from my shortcomings. She was the one who would slip into my room after particularly brutal criticism sessions to assure me that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. "Dad doesn't mean to be so hard on you," she'd whisper, sitting on the edge of my bed in the darkness. "He just wants you to be successful." Even as a child, I suspected she didn't entirely believe her own reassurances, but her presence and concern were balm on wounds that felt impossibly deep. But what I didn't understand then was that Camila's success in managing Harrison's moods came at a cost. She'd learned to suppress her own needs and desires in service of family harmony, becoming hypervigilant about everyone else's emotional states while neglecting her own. She was the family's emotional thermostat, constantly adjusting her behavior to maintain the perfect temperature for Harrison's comfort. Camila had developed an early warning system for Harrison's moods, picking up on subtle cues that the rest of us missed. She could tell from the way he closed the front door whether he'd had a good day at work, could predict from his tone during dinner whether he'd be receptive to requests or questions. She used this intelligence to protect herself and sometimes to shield me from the worst of his criticism. "Don't tell Dad about the B+ in chemistry tonight," she'd warn me after school. "He got that look during dinner, the one where his jaw tightens. Wait until tomorrow when he's in a better mood." Her ability to read these signals was remarkable, but it meant she was constantly monitoring and adjusting her behavior based on his emotional state. But for me, nothing was ever sufficient. I graduated valedictorian from Westfield Academy, delivering a speech that received a standing ovation from the assembled families, but Harrison's response was measured and qualified. "It was a good speech," he said afterward, "though you might have been more gracious in acknowledging the teachers who helped you achieve this honor." The implication was clear. Even my moment of triumph was somehow lacking in proper gratitude and humility. I remember standing on that stage, looking out at the sea of faces, feeling for the first time in my life like I'd achieved something truly meaningful. The speech I'd written was about the importance of intellectual curiosity, about the courage required to question established assumptions, about the responsibility that comes with educational privilege. The audience was silent throughout, hanging on every word, and when I finished, the applause was thunderous. But as I walked off that stage, my eyes immediately sought Harrison's face in the crowd. I saw him clapping politely, his expression neutral, and I felt the familiar drop of disappointment. Other parents were beaming with pride, some wiping away tears, but Harrison looked like he was attending a routine business presentation rather than his daughter's valedictory address. Later at the reception, I overheard him talking to another parent about the speech. "Natalie has always been academically gifted," he was saying, "though sometimes I worry that intellectual achievement can lead to a certain arrogance. It's important for young people to remember that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous." The other parent nodded thoughtfully, and I felt the familiar sting of being diminished even in praise. The reception was held in the school's main hall, decorated with flowers and photographs of the graduating class. I moved through the crowd accepting congratulations, but my attention was divided between responding to well-wishers and monitoring Harrison's conversations. I heard him discussing real estate markets with other parents, mentioning Derek's upcoming college plans, and making casual observations about the importance of practical education over purely academic pursuits. When the principal approached to compliment my speech, Harrison was standing nearby. "Your daughter has a real gift for public speaking," Mr. Richardson said enthusiastically. "That speech was one of the best we've heard in years. You must be very proud." Harrison smiled politely. "Of course we're proud of all our children's achievements," he replied, "though I always remind them that the real test comes after graduation, when they have to apply their knowledge in the real world. Academic success is just the beginning." Even this moment of external validation was reframed as a cautionary reminder about the challenges ahead. I couldn't enjoy the compliment because it was immediately followed by the suggestion that my achievement was merely preliminary, that the real judgments were yet to come. I secured a full academic scholarship to Princeton, an achievement that should have been a source of family pride. But Harrison's immediate response was disappointment that I hadn't chosen his alma mater. "Yale has connections that will serve you throughout your career," he explained, with the patient tone of someone correcting a child's misunderstanding. "Princeton is academically rigorous, but it doesn't have the same social advantages." The fact that I'd earned this opportunity through merit rather than family connections seemed to matter less than his perception that I was rejecting family tradition. Every conversation about my college plans became an opportunity for him to express subtle disappointment in my choices, as if my academic success was somehow diminished by being achieved at the wrong institution. The summer before college became an extended lecture series about missed opportunities and poor judgment. Harrison would bring up my college choice at dinner parties in front of business associates during casual family conversations, always with the same tone of resigned disappointment. "Natalie chose Princeton over Yale," he'd say, as if explaining a tragic mistake to sympathetic listeners. Young people today seem determined to reject the wisdom of previous generations. These conversations were particularly painful because they occurred in front of people whose opinions mattered to me. Family friends who had watched me grow up, teachers who had recommended me for various honors, business associates who might have served as mentors or connections in the future. Harrison's public criticism of my choice served to undermine my confidence while positioning himself as the wise father whose counsel had been foolishly ignored. During college, I worked 3 part-time jobs while maintaining a perfect GPA, a schedule that left me exhausted but determined to prove I could succeed without family financial support. I worked at the library, tutored struggling students, and spent weekends doing research for professors, all while carrying a full course load in Princeton's demanding economics program. The library job was my favorite, despite the long hours and modest pay. I worked the evening shift, helping students navigate research databases and locate academic sources for their papers. The work was quiet and methodical, requiring attention to detail and organizational skills that I'd always possessed. But more importantly, it was the one place where my contributions were valued without question, where my help was genuinely appreciated, where I could succeed based purely on competence rather than family connections or social charm. My supervisor, Mrs. Chen, was a woman in her 60s who had worked at Princeton for over 30 years. She treated me with the kind of respectful professionalism that I'd never experienced from Harrison, evaluating my performance based on reliability, accuracy, and helpfulness, rather than comparing me to some impossible standard or finding fault with my methods. "You have a gift for research," she told me during one of my performance reviews. "Students always leave your consultations feeling more confident about their projects. That's a rare skill." The simple acknowledgement of my abilities, delivered without qualification or criticism, was more meaningful than any praise I'd ever received at home. Yet, during breaks, when I returned home with stories of my experiences and achievements, Harrison's response was always to question why I wasn't interning at more prestigious firms, why I wasn't networking with the right people, why I seemed to be taking the most difficult path towards success rather than leveraging family connections that could smooth the way. I could make some calls, he'd offer, but the suggestion always came with an undertone of criticism for my independence. You don't have to make everything so difficult for yourself, Natalie. There are people who could help you if you just ask. The implication was that my insistence on earning my own way was somehow misguided pride rather than principled determination. These conversations usually took place in his study, a room that exemplified everything about Harrison's worldview. The walls were lined with leather-bound books that looked impressive but were rarely opened, photographs of him with various political and business figures, and awards recognizing his contributions to local charities and professional organizations. His massive desk dominated the space, covered with important-looking documents and expensive accessories that reinforced his authority and success. "Sit down, Natalie," he'd say during these sessions, gesturing to one of the uncomfortable chairs positioned across from his desk. The arrangement was clearly designed to emphasize the power dynamic between us, with him elevated behind his imposing workspace while I sat in a lower chair like a supplicant seeking favor. He'd lean back in his leather chair, fingers steepled, and deliver lectures about practical wisdom and strategic thinking. "Your generation seems to believe that hard work alone guarantees success," he'd say, his tone suggesting this was a naive misconception. "But the reality is that success requires relationships, connections, the ability to leverage opportunities that others have created." The irony was lost on him that I was working harder than most of my classmates, precisely because I didn't have the family connections he was encouraging me to use. While other students could rely on parental networks for internships and job opportunities, I was building my resume through competence and determination, creating my own opportunities through excellence rather than influence. When I graduated summa cum laude, his response was measured skepticism about whether finance was a stable career path. "The financial sector is volatile," he observed, as if this insight was particularly profound. "Real estate, on the other hand, represents tangible assets that maintain value regardless of market fluctuations. Perhaps you should consider joining the family business after all." The suggestion that my 4 years of intensive academic preparation was somehow inferior to his preferred path of real estate development was particularly stinging. I'd spent years studying complex economic theories, market analysis, and financial modeling, but he seemed to view this expertise as less valuable than the practical knowledge he'd gained through decades of property investment. My graduation from Princeton should have been a moment of family celebration, but it became another opportunity for Harrison to express disappointment in my choices. The ceremony itself was magnificent, held on the university's historic campus, with thousands of families celebrating their children's achievements. I walked across that stage knowing I'd earned my degree through merit and hard work, but I couldn't fully enjoy the moment because I was dreading the inevitable criticism that would follow. After graduation, I refused his tepid offer to work at Sterling Development, knowing I'd never be seen as anything but a nepotism hire. The offer itself was telling in its lack of enthusiasm. Harrison presented it as a favor he was doing for me, rather than an opportunity for the company to benefit from my education and skills. "I suppose there might be a position available in our accounting department," he said during one of our discussions about my future plans. "Nothing too demanding initially, of course. You'd need time to learn how real business actually works to understand the difference between academic theory and practical application." The condescension was breathtaking. Here was a man offering his summa cum laude daughter an entry-level position in his company while simultaneously suggesting she was unqualified for anything more challenging. The message was clear. My academic achievements were meaningless in the real world, and I should be grateful for any opportunity he might provide. Instead, I moved to Manhattan with 2 suitcases and determination, sleeping on my friend Riley's couch while applying to every investment firm in the city. Riley had been my roommate during junior and senior year at Princeton, a brilliant mathematics major from a working-class family in Ohio who understood the drive to succeed without family advantages. Riley's tiny studio apartment on the Upper West Side became my base of operations for the most intense job search of my life. I'd wake up at dawn to review financial publications, spent my days networking at industry events and informational interviews, and my evenings researching companies and tailoring cover letters for specific positions. The apartment was a far cry from the luxury I'd grown up with, a fourth-floor walk-up with thin walls, unreliable heating, and a view of an air shaft. But it represented something precious, independence from Harrison's judgment and control. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions based on my own priorities rather than trying to anticipate his criticism. Riley was working her own challenging schedule, having landed a position at a prestigious consulting firm, but she made space for me both physically and emotionally during those difficult months. She'd listen to my frustrations about the job search, offer practical advice about interview strategies, and remind me of my strengths when rejection letters accumulated. "You're brilliant, Nat," she'd say during my moments of self-doubt. "These companies would be lucky to have you. Don't let your father's voice in your head convince you otherwise." Her perspective was invaluable because she'd observed my capabilities without the distortion of family dynamics, seeing me as I actually was rather than as Harrison's disappointing daughter. When I finally landed an entry-level position at Goldman Sachs, Harrison's response was a dismissive, "Let's see if you can handle the pressure." The comment was delivered with a slight smile, as if he was making a friendly observation, but the underlying message was clear. He expected me to fail, and he'd be unsurprised when it happened. The position itself was everything I'd worked toward: demanding, prestigious, intellectually challenging, and completely merit-based. The interview process had been rigorous, including multiple rounds with senior analysts, case study presentations, and technical assessments that tested both my academic knowledge and practical problem-solving abilities. When I called home to share the news, Harrison's response was predictably lukewarm. "Goldman Sachs," he repeated, as if testing the words. "Well, I suppose it's a start, though I hope you understand that the financial sector is notoriously demanding. Many bright young people find themselves overwhelmed by the pressure." Even my acceptance into one of the most competitive training programs in finance was reframed as a cautionary tale about the challenges ahead. There was no acknowledgement of the achievement itself, no recognition of the intense competition I'd beaten, no expression of confidence in my ability to succeed. But I did handle it. For 9 years, I climbed the corporate ladder without family connections or safety nets, fueled by passion, but also by a desperate need to prove him wrong. The work was exactly as demanding as Harrison had predicted, requiring 12-hour days, weekend assignments, constant learning about evolving markets, and the ability to make high-stakes decisions under extreme pressure. My first year was particularly brutal. The learning curve was steep, the competition fierce, and the expectations relentless. I was part of a training class of 20 recent graduates, all of whom had been top performers at their respective universities. The environment was designed to test not just our analytical abilities, but our resilience, our ability to perform under stress, and our commitment to the demanding lifestyle that success in finance required. Many of my classmates had family connections in the industry, parents who could provide guidance about office politics, mentors who could offer career advice, or safety nets that allowed them to take calculated risks. I had none of these advantages, which meant I had to be twice as prepared for every meeting, twice as knowledgeable about every client, twice as reliable in delivering results. But this disadvantage also became a strength. While others could rely on external support systems, I developed complete self-reliance. I learned to research not just the technical aspects of my assignments, but the personalities and preferences of the people I'd be presenting to. I studied successful presentations from previous years, sought feedback from senior colleagues, and constantly refined my approach based on what worked and what didn't. The breakthrough came during my second year, when I was assigned to a team working on a complex merger analysis. The client was considering acquiring a manufacturing company, but the financial projections seemed overly optimistic given market conditions and industry trends. While the senior analysts focused on validating the client's assumptions, I spent my evenings researching comparable transactions and identifying potential risks that hadn't been adequately considered. My analysis revealed several concerning patterns that suggested the acquisition was overpriced and likely to underperform expectations. When I presented my findings to the team leader, she was initially skeptical. Junior analysts weren't expected to challenge the fundamental premises of client strategies. But the data was compelling, and she agreed to include my concerns in the final presentation. The client ultimately decided not to proceed with the acquisition, saving millions of dollars and avoiding what would have been a strategic mistake. 6 months later, the target company declared bankruptcy, validating my analysis and establishing my reputation as someone with exceptional analytical judgment. This success led to more challenging assignments, greater responsibility, and recognition from senior management. But when I called home to share this achievement, Harrison's response was characteristically deflating. "Congratulations on your analysis," he said, his tone suggesting mild interest rather than pride. "Though I hope you understand that being right once doesn't guarantee future success. The financial markets are unpredictable, and overconfidence can be dangerous." Even my professional vindication was reframed as a warning about the dangers of believing in my own abilities. There was no acknowledgement of the skill, preparation, and courage required to challenge senior colleagues and client assumptions. Instead, my success was presented as potentially dangerous to my future development. Just 3 months ago, I'd received a promotion to senior investment strategist, becoming the youngest person in the firm's history to hold the position. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase, recognition from industry publications, and the opportunity to lead my own team of analysts. The announcement was made during the firm's quarterly meeting, with the managing director highlighting my innovative approaches to risk assessment and my track record of successful client outcomes. Natalie has consistently demonstrated the analytical rigor and strategic thinking that define excellence in our industry, he said to the assembled staff. Her promotion reflects not just her individual achievements, but her potential to shape the future direction of our practice. The recognition was everything I'd worked toward, validation of nearly a decade of relentless effort and professional growth. My colleagues congratulated me with genuine enthusiasm, my clients expressed confidence in my expanded role, and industry contacts reached out to explore potential collaborations. The salary increase was substantial, allowing me to finally purchase my dream penthouse in Soho and still have significant savings remaining. The apartment was everything I'd fantasized about during those early years sleeping on Riley's couch. Spacious, elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of Manhattan's skyline. But more important than the material benefits was the psychological impact of the promotion. For the first time in my life, I'd achieved something that was unambiguously mine, earned through competence rather than family connections, recognized by people who evaluated performance rather than bloodlines. It was with those savings that I made what I believed would be the ultimate peace offering, a brand new Mercedes S-Class for Harrison's birthday. The car cost nearly my entire annual salary, but I convinced myself it would be worth it to finally hear him say he was proud of me. Looking back, I can see how pathetic that need for validation was, how it had shaped every major decision in my adult life. My achievements weren't truly mine, but weapons in an unwinnable war for his affection. The decision to buy the car wasn't entirely rational. I'd spent weeks researching luxury vehicles, reading reviews, comparing features, consulting with dealers about the best options for someone of Harrison's age and preferences. The Mercedes S-Class was consistently rated as the pinnacle of automotive luxury, with advanced safety features, superior comfort, and the kind of prestige that would reflect well on its owner. I chose the model carefully, selecting options that I thought Harrison would appreciate: the premium sound system, the heated and massaging seats, the advanced navigation technology, the wine-red leather interior that would complement his sophisticated taste. Every detail was considered, every feature chosen to demonstrate that I understood his preferences and valued his comfort. The purchase process itself was surreal. The salesman treated me with the deference reserved for serious luxury buyers, assuming that someone willing to six figures on a car must be a person of substance and importance. He walked me through every feature with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely got to demonstrate the vehicle's full capabilities. "This is truly the finest sedan in production," he said as we completed the paperwork. "Your father is going to be incredibly impressed. It's not often we see children making such generous gifts to their parents." His assumption that this was a normal expression of filial gratitude rather than a desperate attempt to buy love was both amusing and heartbreaking. The annual Sterling family reunion always fell on the last weekend of June, conveniently timed to celebrate Harrison's birthday and his patriarchal status. This year would be different, I told myself. This year, I had the perfect gift to bridge whatever mysterious gap had existed between us my entire life. What I didn't know was that a simple genetic test I'd taken months earlier would soon explain everything. The test had been done on impulse after a recreational ancestry service flagged genetic inconsistencies. I'd submitted the DNA sample on a whim, curious about our family's European heritage and hoping to learn more about Isabella's mysterious relatives who were rarely mentioned in family stories. The initial results had arrived via email, with cheerful graphics showing my ethnic background and potential DNA matches with distant relatives. But buried in the technical data was a note that had caught my attention. Paternal genetic markers show unexpected variations that may indicate inaccuracies in family history records. I'd initially dismissed this as a glitch in the testing process. Genetic genealogy was still relatively new, and I'd heard stories about incorrect results and database errors. But the phrase unexpected variations had nagged at me, prompting me to research what kinds of family history inaccuracies might produce such results. The more I learned about DNA analysis, the more concerned I became. Paternal genetic markers were among the most reliable indicators in genetic testing, and unexpected variations was a euphemistic way of saying that the person I believed to be my biological father was likely not genetically related to me. I'd ordered a more comprehensive test from a different company, this time focusing specifically on paternity verification. The process required obtaining a DNA sample from Harrison, which I'd managed during a brief visit home by collecting hair from his bathroom brush. The deception felt wrong, but I needed to know the truth that this first test had suggested. The results, now sealed in an envelope in my purse, confirmed what some deep part of me had always suspected. Harrison Sterling was not my biological father. The revelation explained the lifetime of felt otherness, the impossible standards, the emotional distance that no achievement could bridge. Reading those results had been one of the most profound moments of my life. I'd opened the envelope in my Manhattan apartment, surrounded by the symbols of my professional success, and felt the foundations of my identity shift beneath me. The clinical language of the report, probability of paternity 0%, had answered questions I'd carried my entire life while raising new ones about family secrets and hidden truths. The immediate feeling had been relief rather than shock. Finally, there was an explanation for Harrison's inexplicable coldness, his inability to love me as he loved Derek and Camila, his treatment of me as an outsider in my own family. I wasn't his biological daughter, which meant his rejection of me wasn't about my inadequacies, but about a truth he'd apparently known all along. But the relief was quickly followed by other emotions: anger at the deception, curiosity about my real father's identity, and a strange sense of liberation from the futile quest for Harrison's approval. If I wasn't really his daughter, then his opinion of me mattered less than I'd always believed. As I prepared for the reunion, shopping for the perfect outfit that would scream success without appearing desperate, I carried 2 items that would change everything: the keys to a luxury car and the scientific proof that I wasn't truly a Sterling. I had no idea which would prove more explosive. The outfit selection had taken weeks of consideration. I needed something that would convey professional success without appearing to try too hard, something sophisticated enough for Harrison's business associates, but not so formal as to seem out of place at a family gathering. I'd finally settled on a navy blue dress from a designer whose name I knew Harrison would recognize. paired with understated jewelry and shoes that were expensive but not flashy. Every detail was calculated to send the right message, that I was successful enough to afford luxury but tasteful enough to wear it appropriately, that I understood the social codes of Harrison's world while maintaining my own sense of style. Even my choice of accessories was strategic, designed to demonstrate that I'd achieved the kind of success that warranted respect. But beneath the careful preparation was a growing sense of anticipation about the confrontation that might come. The DNA test results gave me a nuclear option that I'd never possessed before, the ability to explain Harrison's behavior in terms that would devastate his carefully constructed family narrative. The question was whether I'd have the courage to use it. The morning of the reunion, I drove the Mercedes to the Sterling estate, my hands trembling as I guided the pristine vehicle up the familiar circular driveway. I'd arranged for the car to be delivered to a nearby dealership, wanting to present it personally, privately, hoping for a moment of connection that had eluded us for 32 years. The Sterling estate looked exactly as it had throughout my childhood, imposing, immaculate, and somehow intimidating despite its beauty. The circular driveway wound through perfectly manicured gardens, past the fountain that Isabella had commissioned during my high school years, up to the grand entrance with its marble columns and hand-carved double doors. Every element of the property was designed to impress visitors with the family's wealth and sophisticated taste. As I parked the Mercedes near the front steps, I noticed how perfectly it complemented the estate's aesthetic. The car's sleek lines and sophisticated engineering seemed to belong in this setting of understated luxury. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine Harrison's reaction, surprise giving way to appreciation, perhaps even pride in having a daughter successful enough to afford such a generous gift. Harrison answered the door in his typical weekend uniform, pressed khakis, and a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His expression registered mild annoyance at my early arrival, as if I'd interrupted something more important than his own daughter's visit. The look was familiar. I'd seen it countless times throughout my childhood when my presence had disrupted his schedule or intruded on his priorities. "Natalie, you're 3 hours early," he said, checking his Rolex with theatrical precision. "The reunion doesn't start until 4. The immediate criticism of my timing was so predictably Harrison that I almost smiled. Even when bearing gifts, I couldn't seem to get the simplest things right in his estimation. But I'd anticipated this reaction and had prepared my response carefully. "I know, Dad," I replied, my heart hammering as I handed him a small gift box containing the Mercedes key fob. "I wanted to give you your birthday gift privately." He accepted the box with the same detached politeness he'd shown for every gift I'd given him over the years, a careful neutrality that suggested appreciation while avoiding actual enthusiasm. His fingers moved slowly as he opened the elegant packaging, and I watched his face carefully for any sign of genuine emotion. His expression shifted to genuine surprise as he recognized the distinctive Mercedes logo, followed by something that might have been pleasure, but it faded quickly to his usual analytical expression. I could see his mind working, calculating the cost, assessing the implications, evaluating whether this gesture represented appropriate filial devotion or concerning extravagance. "This is excessive, Natalie," he said, though he was already moving toward the window where the car sat gleaming in the afternoon sun. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" The question stung because it was so accurate. I was trying to prove everything: my success, my worth, my right to exist in his world, my ability to participate in the kind of generous gestures that he associated with true prosperity. But I couldn't admit any of this without revealing the desperate need for approval that had driven the purchase. "Nothing," I lied, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I got a major promotion, and I wanted to share my success with you." Harrison circled the car like he might inspect a potential property acquisition, noting features, examining details, running his hands along the pristine paintwork with the careful attention of someone evaluating an investment. His approach was systematic and thorough, but completely devoid of the emotional response I'd hoped for. He asked pointed questions about financing that felt more like an interrogation than gratitude. wanting to know about interest rates, payment terms, whether I'd purchased or leased, what kind of insurance coverage I'd secured. Each question reinforced the sense that he viewed this gift as a business transaction rather than an expression of love and appreciation. After a brief test drive where he commented that the handling seemed a bit loose, despite the car's renowned engineering, he parked it in the garage rather than the driveway where arriving guests might see it. The decision felt deliberately dismissive, as if he was embarrassed by the extravagance or unwilling to acknowledge my contribution to his acquisition of such a prestigious vehicle. "Well," he said finally, his tone suggesting the conversation was concluded, "I suppose you must be doing well to afford such extravagance. Though I hope you're not living beyond your means to impress people." The backhanded nature of his response was so perfectly Harrison that I felt a familiar mixture of hurt and resignation. Even a gift worth more than most people's cars became an opportunity to question my judgment and express concern about my financial responsibility. There was no gratitude, no acknowledgement of the sacrifice involved, no recognition of the gesture's significance. That evening, I called Riley from my hotel room, fighting back tears as I recounted the cold reception. The contrast between my expectations and reality was almost comedic in its predictability. I'd spent months planning this gesture, imagining different scenarios for his reaction, but I'd somehow failed to prepare for the possibility that he'd find fault, even with unprecedented generosity. "You know what? Take the car back," Riley said with the fierce loyalty of a friend who'd heard too many similar stories. "He doesn't deserve it, and you don't deserve to be treated like this." Riley's anger on my behalf was both comforting and clarifying. She'd witnessed my relationship with Harrison from the outside, without the emotional complications that made it difficult for me to see the situation clearly. Her perspective was valuable because she could recognize the dysfunction that I'd learned to normalize. "I can't return it now," I replied, though part of me was tempted by the suggestion. It would just confirm his opinion that I'm impulsive and irresponsible. "His opinion is already formed, Nat," Riley said gently. "Nothing you do is going to change how he sees you. The question is whether you're ready to stop trying." I dismissed her suggestion, still clinging to hope that tomorrow would be different. "Just promise me you won't show him that test," Riley warned before we hung up. "Not unless you're ready for nuclear war." I promised, but the envelope remained in my purse, its contents a secret weapon I both feared and couldn't quite abandon. The DNA test results felt like a loaded gun, dangerous to carry but potentially necessary for self-defense. Sunday afternoon arrived with perfect Connecticut weather, as if the universe was conspiring to create the illusion of family harmony. The sky was clear, the temperature ideal, the humidity low enough to make outdoor activities comfortable. It was the kind of day that made Westfield look like a movie set, all rolling green hills and elegant architecture bathed in golden sunlight. I took the scenic route to the estate, using the extra time to rehearse responses to the inevitable questions about my personal life, my career trajectory, my continued single status at the ancient age of 32. The drive through Westfield's tree-lined streets was nostalgic and melancholy. Past houses where childhood friends had lived, schools where I'd spent countless hours pursuing the academic excellence that never seemed sufficient. As I turned onto the familiar tree-lined driveway, I noticed the Mercedes I'd given Harrison prominently displayed near the front entrance, positioned strategically where arriving guests couldn't miss it. The car that had been garage-hidden yesterday was now showcased like a trophy, though I doubted my contribution to its presence would be acknowledged. The transformation was telling. When the gift was private, Harrison had been embarrassed by its extravagance and hidden it from view. But now that guests were arriving, the same car had become a symbol of his success and prosperity, displayed prominently to reinforce his status among his peers. The Sterling Mansion's grand foyer was already crowded with the usual mix of actual family and Harrison's carefully curated collection of business associates who somehow always made the guest list. The space was impressive even by Connecticut standards. Marble floors imported from Italy, a crystal chandelier that had belonged to some European aristocrat, oil paintings of sterling ancestors who'd probably never been as important as the portraits suggested. My mother, Isabella, approached immediately, her face lighting up with genuine warmth as she embraced me. Her greeting was one of the few consistently positive experiences I could expect at these gatherings. Isabella's love for her children was real, even if it was complicated by her relationship with Harrison. "You look absolutely stunning, darling," she whispered, then added in a lower voice, "Your father mentioned the car. How incredibly generous of you." The careful phrasing suggested she understood both the gesture's significance and its likely reception. Isabella had witnessed decades of my attempts to earn Harrison's approval, and she'd learned to navigate these situations with diplomatic precision, acknowledging my efforts without directly criticizing his responses. Before I could respond, Aunt Linda descended with her typical barrage of questions about my love life, while Uncle George offered his standard greeting, "There's our Wall Street wizard." These interactions were predictable, but generally benign, relatives who meant well but didn't really understand my work or my struggles with Harrison's expectations. I noticed Harrison making his entrance from the garden, accompanied by 3 business associates, all laughing at something that was probably only moderately amusing, but treated as hilarious due to the speaker's net worth. His eyes swept the room with practiced authority, acknowledging various guests with nods and brief greetings, until they landed on me. The flicker of recognition was followed by the briefest tightening of his expression before he nodded exactly as he had to distant relatives. There was no special acknowledgement, no indication that I was anything more than another family member requiring polite recognition. The Mercedes gleaming outside might as well have materialized from thin air for all the credit I received. No special greeting for his middle daughter, the one who had just gifted him an automobile worth more than most people's annual salaries. I pretended not to notice, engaging in conversation with my cousin Amber about her medical residency, but the familiar sting of dismissal burned regardless. Derek arrived with his usual flair, making an entrance with his perfect wife Jennifer and their 2 perfect children. I watched Harrison's face transform as he embraced his eldest son, the warmth I'd spent decades trying to earn flowing naturally between them. The contrast was stark and painful. The same man who'd greeted me with polite indifference was now radiating paternal pride and affection. "Dad, that new Mercedes is incredible," Derek said, and I held my breath waiting for Harrison to mention my gift. Instead, he clapped Derek on the shoulder and replied, "Sometimes success requires treating yourself properly, son. When you've built something from nothing, you earn these privileges." The casual erasure of my contribution was so blatant that Camila, who had been standing nearby, shot me a look of sympathetic outrage. Derek continued examining the car through the window, asking technical questions and expressing admiration, while Harrison basked in the reflected glory of ownership without acknowledging the gift that had made it possible. "The interior is phenomenal," Derek continued, pressing his face to the window for a better view. "You've always had excellent taste in vehicles." Harrison's chest visibly swelled with pride at this praise, as if his taste and judgment had been responsible for selecting and purchasing the car. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Harrison explaining various features and Derek expressing appropriate amazement at his father's sophisticated choices. Camila intercepted me before I could process the full impact of Harrison's rewriting of history, pulling me into a genuine hug that lingered just long enough to communicate her understanding of what had just occurred. "Natalie, congratulations on your promotion," she said warmly, using my full name rather than the family nickname. "What you've accomplished is genuinely groundbreaking." Her sincerity was balm on the fresh wound, but it also highlighted the contrast with Harrison's indifference. Camila's ability to recognize and celebrate my achievements made Harrison's blindness even more painful. She understood what I'd accomplished and what it had cost me to get there. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself observing our family dynamics with new clarity, the DNA test results providing a lens through which decades of behavior suddenly made sense. Every interaction seemed to confirm what the scientific evidence had already revealed, that I was fundamentally different from the rest of this family. an outsider whose presence was tolerated but never truly embraced. Harrison held court in the main living room, regaling guests with stories of his latest real estate acquisition while periodically showing off the Mercedes to various groups of associates. Each tour included detailed explanations of the car's features, his face alive with pride I'd never seen directed at me. I counted 4 separate demonstrations before dinner was announced. "He's been doing that all day," Camila murmured, appearing at my elbow with wine. "Mother told me you bought it for him. That was incredibly generous, Natalie." I watched through the bay windows as Harrison settled into the driver's seat, inviting Walter Morrison to experience the passenger-side luxury. The sight of him demonstrating his car to impressed business associates was both infuriating and illuminating. This was how he experienced pride and joy, but never in connection with my achievements. Generosity wasn't really my motivation, I admitted quietly. I just wanted him to finally see me as successful. Camila squeezed my arm gently. "You need to understand something about Dad," she said, choosing her words carefully. "He's never going to give you what you're looking for. It's not because you don't deserve it, but because something in him is fundamentally broken when it comes to you specifically." Her words hit with surprising force, not because they were new information, but because hearing someone else acknowledge the dynamic made it suddenly painfully real. The weight of the envelope in my purse seemed to double, the scientific explanation for his emotional distance pressing against my consciousness like a physical presence. The conversations around us continued with the familiar rhythm of Sterling family gatherings, discussions of business ventures, charitable commitments, social obligations, and family achievements. But I was listening with different ears now, hearing the subtext that had always been present but that I'd learned to ignore. When Harrison's business associate mentioned his son's recent promotion at a law firm, Harrison's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "That's wonderful news, Walter. You must be incredibly proud. There's nothing quite like watching your children excel in demanding professions." The irony was breathtaking. Harrison could celebrate other people's children's professional achievements while remaining blind to my own. His capacity for paternal pride seemed unlimited when directed toward appropriate targets, but somehow unavailable when it came to acknowledging my success. As we moved toward the formal dining room, I made a decision that would change everything. Whatever happened during dinner, I would finally understand why Harrison Sterling had never been able to love me. The DNA test results would either remain my secret or become the key to unlocking 32 years of questions. The dining room was Harrison's masterpiece of formal intimidation. The mahogany table could seat 20 people comfortably, its surface polished to mirror brightness and set with china that had been in Isabella's family for generations. Crystal glasses caught light from the chandelier, reflecting tiny rainbows onto the cream-colored walls lined with portraits of Sterling ancestors. I had no idea which outcome I was hoping for, but I knew I couldn't continue living in the liminal space between truth and comfortable lies. The weight of carrying this secret while watching Harrison's performance of paternal pride had become unbearable. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and I was finally ready to face whatever consequences truth might bring. The envelope in my purse contained more than scientific data. It held the key to understanding 3 decades of emotional exile and the possibility of finally breaking free from the prison of seeking approval from someone who would never provide it. The Sterling formal dining room embodied everything Harrison valued: imposing mahogany furniture, ancestral portraits watching judgmentally from the walls, and place settings that prioritized appearance over comfort. Isabella had outdone herself with the arrangements, crystal glasses catching light from the chandelier, fresh peonies positioned precisely between gleaming silver serving pieces. Every element of the table setting was perfect, from the crisp white linens to the carefully folded napkins, from the multiple forks and spoons arranged in proper sequence to the fresh flowers that added color without overwhelming the elegant simplicity of the design. Isabella had spent years perfecting these presentations, understanding that Harrison's approval extended to every detail of their entertaining. I found my name card predictably far from the head of the table, seated between Amber's husband, David, and one of Harrison's younger business associates. The physical distance from meaningful conversation felt intentional, safely removing me from any spotlight that might acknowledge my recent promotion or professional achievements. The seating arrangement was a map of family hierarchy and social importance. Harrison commanded the head of the table like a CEO at a board meeting, with the most important business associates positioned within easy conversation distance. Family members were interspersed strategically to facilitate introductions and maintain social flow, but my placement suggested I was considered more of a supporting player than a main character in this family drama. Derek naturally commanded the prime position near Harrison, with Camila and her husband serving as diplomatic buffers between the inner circle and lesser relations. Isabella sat at the opposite end, her placement a perfect illustration of her role, technically equal, but separated by the expanse of polished wood, connected yet distant. As the first course arrived, delicate lobster bisque served with military precision, Harrison rose with practiced authority, wine glass in hand. The room fell silent immediately, all attention turning to the patriarch who had orchestrated this gathering for his own glorification. The waitstaff moved with choreographed efficiency, each server knowing exactly when to appear and disappear, when to refill glasses, and when to remain invisible. It was the kind of seamless service that required extensive planning and coordination, another reflection of Isabella's attention to detail and Harrison's expectation of perfection. "Welcome, family and friends, to our annual celebration," he began, his public persona polished to perfection. "Each year I'm reminded of how fortunate I am to have built not just a successful business, but a legacy embodied by my children." His voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention, the practiced cadence of someone who'd given countless speeches at business functions and charity events. This was Harrison in his element, the center of attention, the acknowledged leader, the patriarch whose wisdom and success deserved recognition and respect. His gaze swept proudly over Derek, who nodded with appropriate humility, then to Camila, who smiled graciously. When his eyes reached me, they passed over as if I occupied the same visual plane as the wallpaper, continuing to acknowledge his business associates with warm recognition. The omission was subtle enough that casual observers might miss it, but devastating in its precision. In a single glance, Harrison had managed to include every important person at the table while somehow rendering me invisible. It was a masterclass in passive aggression delivered with such smooth authority that questioning it would seem petty and inappropriate. "Tonight, we celebrate not just family, but the values that create lasting success," Harrison continued, raising his glass higher. "Hard work, integrity, and the wisdom to build upon proven foundations rather than chase fleeting trends." The words were carefully chosen to sound inspirational while delivering subtle criticism. The reference to fleeting trends could easily be interpreted as commentary on my career in finance, a field Harrison had always considered less substantial than real estate development. The toast proceeded with Harrison highlighting Derek's latest property development, Camila's appointment to the hospital board, and concluding with pointed observations about the difference between substantial achievement and superficial recognition. His eyes finally landed on me with unmistakable meaning as he emphasized the importance of building something lasting rather than chasing temporary accolades. Even in his moment of supposed celebration, Harrison couldn't resist the opportunity to diminish my accomplishments by implication. My promotion to senior investment strategist, my innovative risk assessment models, my recognition by industry publications, all of it was reduced to temporary accolades in comparison to what he considered real achievement. As the meal progressed through multiple elaborate courses, Harrison directed conversation with subtle cues, ensuring topics remained within his preferred domains. When Isabella gently attempted to mention my promotion during a lull, Harrison smoothly intercepted. "Speaking of market volatility, Walter, what's your assessment of the upcoming zoning changes?" The redirection was so smooth that most guests probably didn't notice it, but the message was clear. My professional achievements weren't worthy of discussion among serious adults. Harrison's ability to control conversational flow was remarkable, ensuring that topics remained focused on subjects where he could demonstrate expertise and authority. The familiar pattern had fully emerged by the fish course, with Harrison periodically directing pointed questions in my direction, each designed to undermine rather than engage. "Natalie, your firm focuses primarily on domestic markets, correct? Rather limiting in our global economy. Or, I understand your recent promotion came after the Peterson account." Fortunate timing that Derek was able to facilitate that introduction. Each comment was carefully constructed to reframe my achievements as either limited in scope or dependent on family connections I had actively avoided using. The Peterson account reference was particularly galling because it was completely false. I'd never asked Derek for any professional introductions and had won that account through competitive bidding. I maintained the pleasant professionalism I'd perfected in hostile boardrooms, refusing to show the emotional reaction he seemed designed to provoke. "Actually, Harrison," I replied with practiced lightness, "our international division adopted my risk assessment model globally, and the Peterson account came through a blind competitive pitch process." My corrections were delivered with clinical precision, though I noticed Camila's sympathetic glances at each exchange. The familiar dance was painful in its predictability, but something had shifted in my perspective. The DNA test results had created an emotional distance that allowed me to observe rather than simply endure. As the main course, an unnecessarily elaborate beef Wellington, was served, Harrison opened another bottle of vintage wine, his consumption having steadily increased throughout the evening. Isabella tracked his drinking with nervous glances, a pattern I'd observed since childhood but never fully understood. The alcohol seemed to lower Harrison's inhibitions without affecting his strategic thinking. If anything, the wine made him more direct in his criticism, less concerned with maintaining the pretense of paternal support. His questions became sharper, his implications more obvious, his dismissals less subtle. During the brief respite, while everyone focused on the complex dish, Harrison leaned over to whisper something to Derek, receiving a dismissive gesture in response. The interaction struck me as oddly familiar, though I couldn't immediately place why. As dessert and coffee were served, Harrison's attention swung back to me, alcohol having eroded whatever minimal filters he typically maintained. "Natalie, Mrs. Morrison mentioned you're still single," he said, his voice carrying farther than necessary. "Such accomplished women often struggle with relationships. The men in New York must find your intensity challenging." The casual cruelty landed with practiced precision, delivered with the tone of paternal concern rather than the hostile assessment it actually was. The room fell into uncomfortable silence, as relatives who had witnessed similar attacks over the years studied their dessert plates with sudden fascination. The comment was designed to hit multiple targets simultaneously. My professional success was reframed as a liability. My independence was pathologized as intensity, and my single status was presented as evidence of fundamental undesirability. It was masterful in its efficiency, managing to undermine my personal and professional life in a single observation. "I appreciate your concern for my personal fulfillment," I replied evenly, drawing on every negotiation technique I'd ever learned. "But as you've often emphasized, success requires focus, and my results speak for themselves." Harrison's expression darkened at my refusal to be diminished. "Results," he repeated, swirling his brandy contemplatively. "Yes, well, some people measure success by titles and salary figures, but true accomplishment comes from building something lasting, something that extends beyond individual achievement." He gestured toward Derek and Camila. "My children understand the difference between genuine success and mere performance." The deliberate exclusion of me from his children was so blatant that even his business associates shifted uncomfortably. I felt the familiar pressure building behind my eyes, the childhood urge to flee, fighting against adult determination to maintain dignity. But something was different this time. The DNA test results had created a psychological buffer, allowing me to observe his cruelty with clinical detachment rather than personal devastation. He wasn't rejecting his daughter. He was confirming what genetic science had already revealed. The weight of the envelope in my purse seemed to pulse with potential energy, 32 years of questions finally having an answer. The moment of truth was approaching with inevitable momentum, and I realized I was ready to stop protecting Harrison's comfortable lies. As Harrison pushed his chair back slightly, preparing for one of his traditional speeches, I reached into my purse and touched the envelope containing the test results. The moment of truth was approaching, and I had to decide whether to continue protecting his carefully constructed narrative or finally reveal the foundation it was built upon. The room fell silent in anticipation of his remarks, everyone assuming this would be another celebration of Sterling family achievements. Instead, it would become the moment when 32 years of lies finally came crashing down. Harrison stood, brandy snifter in hand, his expression taking on the benevolent authority he reserved for these performances. The alcohol had given his cheeks a slight flush, but his posture remained commanding, his voice clear and confident. This was his stage, his audience, his moment to hold court and receive the admiration he believed he deserved. "Before we adjourn to the garden for photographs," he began, his voice carrying the particular timbre of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "I want to express my pride in what the Sterling family continues to accomplish." He gestured expansively, including his business associates in this supposed dynasty. The movement was theatrical, designed to encompass not just the immediate family, but the broader community of success that he'd assembled around himself. His business relationships weren't merely professional, they were extensions of his identity, proof of his importance and influence. "A family is like a successful business venture," he continued, warming to his theme. "It requires vision, leadership, and members who understand their roles in creating collective success." The business metaphor was vintage Harrison, reducing human relationships to corporate structures with himself as the CEO. In his worldview, family members were employees whose value was determined by their contribution to the overall enterprise, their willingness to enhance rather than detract from the Sterling brand. His gaze swept the table with practiced authority. "As I look around this room, I see the fruits of careful cultivation, of values passed down through generations. I see children who have embraced the lessons I've taught them and elevated them to new heights." The familiar pattern was emerging, the careful praise that would exclude me through pointed omission. But this time, I was ready. My hand closed around the envelope in my purse, 32 years of questions about to receive their answer. "Derek," Harrison continued, turning toward his golden child with unmistakable warmth, "your development projects continue to exceed even my expectations. The Riverside complex represents exactly the kind of visionary thinking that distinguishes Sterling Properties from lesser ventures." Derek nodded with practiced humility, though his satisfaction was evident. He'd learned to receive Harrison's praise with the appropriate mixture of gratitude and modesty, understanding that excessive enthusiasm might diminish the compliment's value. The dynamic between them was smooth, natural, unforced, everything my relationship with Harrison had never been. "Your ability to see potential where others see problems," Harrison continued, "demonstrates the kind of strategic thinking that will serve you well as you eventually take over the family business. You've proven that the Sterling name will continue to mean something important in this community." The implicit promise of succession was new, and I saw Derek's eyes widen slightly at this public commitment to his future leadership. Harrison had never been so explicit about his plans for the business, but the alcohol and the admiring audience had apparently loosened his tongue about family hierarchy and expectations. Harrison's expression warmed further as he shifted to Camila, his voice taking on a different quality, still proud, but softer, more protective. "And Camila, your grace in balancing family responsibilities with community leadership demonstrates remarkable maturity. Your hospital board work has brought genuine prestige to the Sterling name." Camila smiled graciously, though I noticed a slight tension around her eyes. She'd always been uncomfortable with public attention, preferring to work behind the scenes rather than receiving recognition for her efforts. Her community involvement was genuine and substantial, but she pursued it out of personal conviction rather than desire for family approval. "Your mother and I couldn't be prouder of the woman you've become," Harrison continued. "The family you're raising and the values you're instilling in the next generation of Sterlings. You represent everything we hoped our children would achieve." The praise was generous and heartfelt, demonstrating Harrison's capacity for paternal pride when directed toward appropriate targets. His love for Camila was real and uncomplicated, unmarked by the strange hostility that had always characterized his relationship with me. Then came the moment I'd been dreading and simultaneously anticipating for 32 years. Harrison's gaze finally landed on me, his eyes narrowing slightly as he prepared his calculated attack. The warmth that had infused his voice when speaking about Derek and Camila evaporated, replaced by something colder and more clinical. "As I reflect on my children's accomplishments," he continued, his voice modulating to what others might mistake for thoughtfulness, "I'm reminded that success can be measured in many ways. Some achievements have substance and staying power, while others are merely superficial." The word superficial hung in the air like a poison dart, clearly intended for me though never explicitly stated. The guests who knew our family dynamics understood the target. Those who didn't would interpret this as general wisdom about the nature of achievement. He raised his glass higher, the theatrical pause allowing tension to build while he savored the moment of absolute control. Every eye in the room was focused on him, every ear attuned to his words, every mind processing the careful implications of his speech. "I'm proud of all my children," and for a suspended moment I felt a ridiculous flutter of hope, the same desperate optimism that had driven me to buy him the Mercedes, the pathetic belief that this time might be different. Except for the pathetic loser who's never understood what real success means. The words hit the room like a detonation, followed by shocked silence as every eye turned toward me. The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision, the public humiliation complete and deliberate. Harrison had chosen this moment, this audience, this perfect setup to deliver the most devastating rejection possible. But instead of the familiar devastation I'd experienced countless times before, I felt something unexpected, a cold, clarifying calm. The DNA test results had reframed everything, transforming this moment from personal rejection to confirmation of scientific fact. He wasn't destroying his daughter, he was revealing that I'd never truly been his daughter at all. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, guests shifting uncomfortably as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Some looked embarrassed to have been present for such a brutal family moment. Others appeared shocked by Harrison's cruelty, but most seemed frozen by the unexpected turn from celebration to character assassination. I could feel Isabella's mortification radiating from the far end of the table, could see Camila's face pale with shock and sympathy, could sense Derek's uncomfortable satisfaction at having his superior status so publicly confirmed. The business associates exchanged glances, clearly regretting their presence at what had become an intensely personal family drama. Harrison continued as if he'd made a casual observation about the weather, his voice carrying the dismissive tone I'd heard my entire life, but amplified by alcohol and audience. Some people confuse titles with achievement, salary with success. They chase recognition rather than building something meaningful, pursuing validation instead of creating value. He was in full flow now, emboldened by his captive audience and the lack of immediate challenge to his authority. The brandy had given him license to say things that might normally remain subtext, to make explicit the criticisms that were usually delivered through implication and omission. "True success comes from understanding your place in something larger than yourself," he continued, his gaze fixed on me with unmistakable meaning. "From contributing to family legacy rather than seeking personal glory, from building upon foundations rather than constantly trying to prove individual worth." Every word was chosen for maximum impact, each phrase designed to reduce my professional achievements to evidence of character flaws. In Harrison's narrative, my independence became selfishness, my success became vanity, my refusal to join the family business became betrayal of sacred obligations. The deliberate vagueness fooled no one. While Harrison never used my name, every person at that table understood exactly who was being discussed and dismissed. The technique was masterful in its plausible deniability. He could later claim to have been speaking generally about modern attitudes toward success rather than attacking his daughter specifically. I remained frozen for several seconds, experiencing the physical sensations of humiliation with clinical detachment. The burning face, the constricted throat, the accelerated heartbeat, the fight-or-flight response flooding my system with adrenaline. But underneath the familiar physiological reactions was something new, a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in my life, Harrison's cruelty couldn't reach the core of my identity because I finally understood its source. He wasn't rejecting me because I was inadequate. He was rejecting me because I represented a truth he'd spent 32 years trying to deny. The room remained suspended in uncomfortable tension as I stood slowly, my movement so deliberate that it commanded immediate attention. The shocked silence stretched as everyone waited for my reaction, perhaps expecting tears or another hasty exit as had happened in previous years. Instead, I felt an almost supernatural composure settle over me. "Thank you, Harrison," I said, my voice carrying clearly without effort. The use of his first name, rather than Dad, was intentional, a subtle signal that the rules of engagement had changed. That was illuminating. I smoothed my dress with steady hands, the composure apparently more unnerving than an emotional breakdown would have been. Around the table, faces registered confusion and concern as the family drama took an unexpected turn. This wasn't following the usual script of my humiliation and retreat. "I've spent 3 decades trying to earn something that was never going to be granted," I continued, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what was coming. Chasing acceptance from someone who was genetically programmed to withhold it. Harrison's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to wariness as he recognized this script wasn't following its usual pattern. The compliant middle daughter was deviating from her assigned role, and he didn't like the direction. His eyes darted around the table, perhaps calculating how to regain control of the narrative. "For those keeping score," I said with deliberate lightness, "I graduated top of my class from Princeton, built a Wall Street career without family connections, and recently became the youngest senior investment strategist in my firm's history. By most objective measures, hardly the definition of pathetic loser." The factual recitation of my achievements created a stark contrast with Harrison's character assassination. Several guests nodded slightly, their expressions suggesting they were beginning to question the accuracy of his assessment. The business associates, in particular, seemed to recognize the significance of my professional accomplishments. I allowed my gaze to sweep the table, making brief eye contact with relatives who had witnessed decades of this dynamic. The validation was gratifying, but no longer necessary. I had moved beyond needing external confirmation of my worth. But success in Harrison Sterling's world has never been about objective achievement, has it? I continued, my attention returning to the man at the head of the table. It's about reflecting glory back upon him, about confirming his narrative of patriarchal wisdom, about playing assigned roles in his personal mythology. The analysis was clinical and accurate, stripping away the emotional charge to reveal the underlying power dynamics. Harrison's face was reddening, whether from alcohol, embarrassment, or anger, but he seemed temporarily speechless in the face of this unexpected challenge. I reached into my purse with deliberate calm, aware that every movement was being closely observed. The unusual spectacle of the family disappointment finally standing up to the patriarch was too compelling to ignore. The envelope crinkled slightly as my fingers closed around it, 32 years of questions about to receive their definitive answer. "I bought you a car worth more than most people's annual salary," I said directly to Harrison, whose face had settled into the cold mask he wore during difficult business negotiations. "Not because you needed it, but because I still harbored the childish hope that a grand enough gesture might finally bridge whatever mysterious gap has existed between us." The reference to the Mercedes sitting outside created a moment of cognitive dissonance for the guests who had admired it earlier. The expensive gift that Harrison had proudly displayed was revealed as a desperate attempt to purchase approval, recontextualizing both the gesture and his response to it. From my purse, I withdrew the envelope containing the DNA test results. The paper seemed almost mundane considering the explosive information it contained, but I knew its contents would detonate 32 years of carefully constructed lies. For 3 decades, I've blamed myself for your inability to show me the affection you freely give Derek and Camila, I said, placing the envelope precisely in the center of the table. I've twisted myself into countless shapes trying to become worthy of your approval, never understanding that the problem wasn't in my actions, but in my genetics. A collective intake of breath circled the table as the implication registered. Isabella's face drained of all color, while Derek straightened with sudden alertness, finally understanding that this moment was bigger than typical family drama. The business associates exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. DNA doesn't lie, Harrison, I said, infusing his name with all the irony the moment deserved. Happy Father's Day to the man who's spent my entire life punishing me for existing. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the gentle ticking of Isabella's antique clock and the distant sound of traffic from the main road. Harrison's face had gone completely white, then flushed red as the implications crashed over him like a tsunami of revelation. You, he started, then stopped, his usual articulate authority failing him completely. His eyes darted to Isabella, who was staring at the envelope as if it contained nuclear material. The carefully constructed family narrative was crumbling in real time, 32 years of secrets suddenly exposed to public scrutiny. Yes, I confirmed simply, my voice carrying across the stunned silence. The paternity test confirms what you've always known but never acknowledged. I'm not your biological daughter, which explains why you've never been able to love me like one. The explosion of voices that followed was immediate and overwhelming. Derek demanding explanations, Camila asking if this was some kind of joke, guests murmuring in shock, and through it all, Harrison's voice rising above the chaos in a mixture of rage and panic. "How dare you?" he began, but I cut him off with a gesture that surprised everyone, including myself. The quiet authority in my movement commanded attention more effectively than shouting would have. "How dare I what?" I asked with genuine curiosity. "Tell the truth? Present scientific evidence? Stop pretending that your emotional abuse was somehow my fault?" My voice remained steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I'm done protecting your carefully constructed narrative." The word abuse landed with particular force, reframing decades of behavior in clinical terms that were difficult to dispute. Several guests looked genuinely shocked, as if seeing our family dynamics clearly for the first time. The business associates appeared deeply uncomfortable, caught between loyalty to Harrison and recognition of his cruelty. "This is preposterous," Harrison said, his voice gaining strength as he attempted to regain control. "Some laboratory error? Some misunderstanding? You're making a scene based on questionable science, embarrassing yourself and this family with wild accusations." But his protests lacked conviction, and his eyes kept darting to Isabella's stricken face. The truth was written in her expression, confirming what the test results had revealed. The mystery of my parentage was solving itself in real time as family secrets finally surfaced. Without waiting for further response, I turned and walked from the dining room, my pace unhurried, my dignity intact. Behind me, the sound of chaos erupted as 32 years of family secrets finally burst into the open. Chairs scraped against hardwood floors, voices rose in urgent conversation, and Harrison's authority crumbled as the foundations of his family mythology collapsed. The evening air was cool against my flushed skin as I walked to my car, but I wasn't headed home. Not yet. The Mercedes sat where Harrison had positioned it for maximum visibility, gleaming under the estate's decorative lighting like a monument to misplaced hope and desperate generosity. The irony wasn't lost on me that the car I'd purchased to earn his approval had become the symbol of my final rejection of his authority. The keys were still in my purse. I'd kept the spare set, a precaution that now seemed prophetic rather than practical. The decision wasn't conscious so much as inevitable. I slid into the driver's seat, the leather interior still carrying that new car smell mixed with the faint trace of Harrison's cologne. Through the windshield, I could see the front door flying open, Harrison's figure framed in the light, his mouth open in what might have been my name. But whatever he was shouting was lost beneath the gentle purr of the German-engineered engine as it came to life. The dashboard illuminated with welcoming lights, The GPS system activated with a cheerful greeting, and for the first time since arriving at the estate, I felt completely in control of my circumstances. As I reversed down the driveway, I caught a glimpse of Harrison running into the street behind me, his normally composed face contorted with an expression I'd never seen before. Something beyond anger, beyond control, pure primal fury at losing command of his carefully orchestrated narrative. The sight should have been satisfying, but instead it filled me with a strange mixture of pity and relief. Harrison Sterling, the powerful patriarch who had shaped my entire life through the withholding of approval, was revealed in this moment as simply a man whose lies had finally caught up with him. The symmetry was perfect. The luxury car he'd showcased to associates, while minimizing my contribution, now physically removed, just as I was removing myself from the toxic dynamic that had defined my existence for 32 years. Both acts of reclamation, both statements of independence, both refusals to continue participating in his version of family theater. I made it to the highway before the first call came through, Camila's name flashing on the dashboard display. I let it go to voicemail, then Derek, then Isabella, the digital evidence of chaos left in my wake. Each missed call was a small victory, proof that I was finally prioritizing my own peace over their emotional needs. As I drove toward Hartford instead of back to New York, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: complete freedom from the need to justify my existence to anyone. The weight I'd carried for 32 years had finally been lifted, not through his acceptance but through my own liberation from seeking it. The road stretched ahead of me, dark except for my headlights and the occasional sweep of oncoming traffic. For the first time in my life, I was traveling without a destination dictated by others' expectations, without a schedule designed to prove my worth, without the crushing weight of seeking approval from someone constitutionally incapable of providing it. The luxury hotel where I checked in that night provided the perfect environment for processing the seismic shift that had occurred. Room service, a bottle of wine, and finally, the space to read the dozens of messages that had accumulated on my phone, like evidence of the earthquake I'd triggered. The luxury hotel where I checked in that night provided the perfect environment for processing the seismic shift that had occurred. Room service, a bottle of wine, and finally, the space to read the dozens of messages that had accumulated on my phone, like evidence of the earthquake I'd triggered. The Hartford Marriott's executive suite felt like a sanctuary after the emotional battlefield I'd just escaped. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city lights, while the marble bathroom and Egyptian cotton linens provided the kind of luxury that money could buy. Unlike the acceptance I'd spent 32 years trying to purchase with achievements and expensive gifts. I ordered a bottle of Chateau Margaux, the kind of wine Harrison would have appreciated for its prestige and price point, and settled into the oversized leather chair to review the digital fallout from my revelation. Each notification represented another ripple in the expanding wave of consequences that would reshape our family forever. Camila's texts ranged from confused, "What just happened? Please call me," to concerned, "Mom is locked in her room crying," to informative, "Dad is making crazy legal threats about the car. Derek is furious. Half the guests left early." Her messages painted a picture of complete chaos, the carefully orchestrated Sterling family image dissolving in real time. The progression of her texts told the story of the evening's aftermath in real time. The initial confusion gave way to practical updates as she became the family's unofficial crisis manager, trying to contain damage while processing her own shock at the revelations. "The Petersons left without saying goodbye," read one message. Walter Morrison asked Dad 3 times if the DNA test was legitimate before finally leaving. "Uncle George is demanding explanations. This is a complete disaster." But underneath her distress, I detected something else in Camila's messages, a strange sense of relief. For the first time in our lives, the family's dysfunction was fully exposed. The secrets that had shaped our relationships finally brought into the light. The truth was devastating, but it was also liberating. Derek's messages were characteristically threatening and self-righteous. "You've humiliated our family in front of Dad's business associates. Whatever sick game you're playing ends now." Return his car immediately and apologize for your disgusting accusations, or I'll make sure you regret this for the rest of your life. His loyalty to Harrison was predictable, but revealing. Derek's entire identity was built on being the favored son, the heir apparent, the one who had earned paternal approval through natural excellence. My revelation threatened that narrative by suggesting that Harrison's rejection of me was based on hidden knowledge rather than merit-based evaluation. The subsequent messages became increasingly frantic as Derek realized the implications for his own position. If Harrison's treatment of me was based on genetic knowledge, what did that say about the authenticity of the praise Derek had received? Was he truly superior, or simply biologically preferred? Isabella's voicemails were the most heartbreaking, progressing from composed attempts at damage control to emotional devastation as the full weight of 32 years of secrecy crashed over her. Her first message was carefully modulated, the public voice she used for difficult social situations. "Natalie, darling, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Please come home so we can discuss this as a family. These genetic tests aren't always accurate, and jumping to conclusions based on incomplete information can be very damaging." But by her fifth message, the composed facade had crumbled completely. "The test is real, isn't it? Oh God, what have I done? I never meant for you to find out this way. I never meant for you to suffer because of my mistakes. Please, please call me. There's so much you need to understand about what happened, about the choices I made, about why everything became so complicated." The raw emotion in her voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from Isabella. The carefully controlled sterling matriarch had been replaced by a woman confronting the consequences of decisions made decades earlier, choices that had seemed reasonable at the time, but had created a lifetime of pain for everyone involved. But the most revealing response came from Harrison himself, delivered through his attorney rather than any personal communication. The formal legal letter arrived via email within hours of my departure. Its corporate letterhead and clinical language a perfect representation of Harrison's inability to engage with emotional reality. "Dear Miss Sterling," it began, the formal address immediately establishing distance and hostility. "Our client, Mr. Harrison Sterling, demands the immediate return of the vehicle gifted on June 28th, as well as cessation of defamatory statements regarding paternity made in the presence of witnesses." The letter continued with threats of legal action, demands for public retraction of my false and malicious claims, and warnings about the consequences of continued harassment and slander. Every paragraph reinforced the transactional nature of Harrison's worldview, his inability to process family crisis as anything other than a business problem requiring legal solutions. The contrast with Isabella's emotional voicemails was stark and telling. While she grappled with guilt, regret, and desperate desire for reconciliation, Harrison's response was purely defensive, focused on protecting his reputation and controlling the narrative rather than addressing the underlying truth of the situation. No personal message, no attempt at explanation, no acknowledgement of 32 years of emotional distance that suddenly made perfect sense. Even in crisis, Harrison couldn't connect with me as a human being, only as a problem to be managed through legal intimidation. As I settled into the hotel's comfortable bed with my wine and the accumulated messages, I realized the most profound truth of the evening. I had finally stopped seeking love from someone constitutionally incapable of providing it. The DNA test hadn't just revealed Harrison's lack of biological connection to me. It had freed me from the psychological prison of seeking his approval. For the first time in 32 years, I fell asleep without the weight of his disappointment pressing against my chest. The familiar anxiety about his judgment, the constant calculation of how to earn his praise, the exhausting performance of trying to become worthy of love, all of it was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. The next morning brought clarity along with room service coffee and the Hartford Courant's business section. As I reviewed market reports and financial analyses, I felt my professional identity reasserting itself, separate from and uncontaminated by family drama. My work existed in a realm where competence mattered more than genetics, where results spoke louder than bloodlines. The weeks following what I'd come to think of as the revelation unfolded with surprising clarity and unexpected complications. The initial chaos gave way to a strange kind of peace as I began rebuilding my life on a foundation of truth rather than the shifting sands of conditional love. Isabella requested a private meeting 3 days after the dinner, her appearance shocking me with its vulnerability. The carefully maintained sterling matriarch facade was completely absent, replaced by a woman who looked both older and more authentically human than I'd ever seen her. We met at a small cafe in downtown Hartford, far from Westfield's social circles and the possibility of uncomfortable encounters with family friends. Isabella arrived early, clutching a worn leather handbag and looking around nervously as if expecting paparazzi to document her disgrace. "His name was Michael Chen," she began without preamble, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. "We met at Yale. He was finishing his engineering doctorate while I was completing my master's in art history. He was brilliant, kind, everything my parents considered completely inappropriate for their daughter." The story unfolded like a period drama, each detail adding depth to the woman I'd never really known. Isabella described a passionate relationship that had lasted nearly 2 years, conducted in secret because of her family's expectations and social prejudices that made an interracial relationship scandalous in their circles. "My parents discovered our relationship through a friend who saw us together in New Haven," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "They forbade me to see him immediately, threatened to cut off my education funding, disown me entirely if I continued what they called this embarrassing infatuation. Young love crushed by family expectations, a pregnancy discovered after the relationship had been forcibly ended, and Harrison's calculated offer of marriage that solved everyone's problems except mine. The narrative explained so much about Isabella's relationship with her own parents, her submission to Harrison's authority, her inability to protect me from his emotional distance. I was terrified and alone," she said, her voice barely audible above the cafe's ambient noise. 22 years old, pregnant, completely dependent on my family's financial support. When Harrison proposed, it seemed like salvation, respectability, secure other for my child, acceptance back into the social world I'd been raised to value. Harrison's proposal hadn't been romantic, but strategic, she explained. He'd recently started his real estate development company and needed connections to established Connecticut families. Isabella's pedigree and social networks provided access to the kind of clients and investors who could accelerate his business growth. "He promised to raise you as his own," Isabella explained. Her eyes focused on some middle distance where the past still lived. "And I believed he truly intended to keep that promise. But from the moment you were born, you had Michael's analytical mind, his way of questioning everything rather than accepting authority. Harrison tried, but every time he looked at you, he saw another man's child." The revelation was both devastating and liberating. I finally understood the source of the inexplicable coldness, the impossible standards, the emotional distance that no achievement could bridge. Harrison hadn't been rejecting his daughter. He'd been rejecting the living reminder of his wife's life before him, the physical evidence that he'd been second choice rather than true love. "Why didn't you protect me?" I asked, the question carrying 3 decades of accumulated hurt. "You watched him undermine every achievement, dismiss every success, treat me like an unwanted obligation. How could you let that continue for 30 years? Isabella's face crumpled with a grief so raw it was difficult to witness. "Because I was a coward," she replied simply. "Every time I considered telling you the truth, the potential consequences seemed too great. I told myself you were strong enough to handle his coldness, that you'd eventually stop seeking his approval. I didn't realize how much damage I was allowing." She described the impossible position she'd occupied, caught between her guilt over the deception and her fear of losing the life she'd built. "I thought about leaving him many times, especially when you were younger, and his rejection of you was so obvious. But where would we go? How would I support us? I'd never worked, never developed any skills beyond being a society wife." The conversation lasted 4 hours, ending with the beginning of a more honest relationship that would require years to fully rebuild. But for the first time in my life, I had a mother who spoke to me without performing for an invisible audience, without filtering every word through Harrison's anticipated judgment. The most surprising development came a week later when I received an email from Michael Chen himself. Isabella had contacted him after the dinner, explaining my existence and requesting permission to share his contact information. The message was cautious but warm, revealing a man who had spent decades wondering about the woman who had disappeared from his life. "I've thought about your mother every day for 32 years, he wrote. "She was the love of my life, and losing her was the defining heartbreak of my youth. Learning that I have a daughter, that something beautiful came from our relationship, is the most unexpected gift I could imagine." Michael had built a successful engineering consulting firm in San Francisco, married a lovely woman named Patricia, and raised 2 sons who were technically my half-brothers. His professional achievements were substantial but described with humility, his personal life stable and fulfilling. The email painted a picture of the kind of man who might have been a loving father given the opportunity. "I understand this must be overwhelming for you," he continued. "Please don't feel any pressure to meet or establish a relationship, but if you're interested in learning more about your biological heritage, I'd be honored to share whatever you'd like to know." We arranged to meet at a quiet restaurant in Manhattan, the experience of seeing my own expressions and mannerisms reflected in a stranger, both surreal and oddly comforting. Michael had aged well, his graying hair and lined face giving him distinguished appearance that reminded me of professors I'd admired at Princeton. "You have your mother's grace," he observed over dinner, "but that intensity when you discuss market analysis, that's definitely from my side of the family. My father was an engineer. My grandfather was a mathematics professor. We've always been people who need to understand how systems work." Our relationship developed cautiously, both of us respectful of its unusual beginning and the complicated emotions involved. We built connection through shared intellectual interests and the gradual discovery of genetic commonalities that explained lifelong traits I'd never seen reflected in the Sterling family. Michael's analytical approach to problems, his methodical thinking, his need to understand underlying principles rather than accepting surface explanations, all of these were characteristics I'd always possessed but had never seen mirrored in Harrison or Derek. Meeting my biological father provided context for aspects of my personality that had always felt foreign within the Sterling family dynamics. Harrison's response to these developments was characteristically cold and litigious. He demanded return of the Mercedes through his attorney, threatened legal action for defamation, and made it clear that any contact with me would be conducted through legal representatives rather than personal communication. The finality of his rejection, which might have devastated me months earlier, now produced something closer to pity. His limitations had become glaringly apparent, his emotional rigidity a prison of his own construction. The man who had shaped my life through the withholding of approval was revealed as fundamentally incapable of the love I'd spent decades trying to earn. Derek maintained his loyalty to Harrison, their shared genetics and worldview, creating a natural alliance against the disruption I'd introduced to their family narrative. But Camila surprised everyone by reaching out consistently, our relationship deepening through honest conversations about family dynamics we'd both observed but never discussed openly. "He's been controlling the narrative our entire lives," she observed during one of our weekly calls. "Making us compete for approval that was never equally available. I benefited from that system, but I always saw how it hurt you. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you more." Her acknowledgement helped heal wounds I hadn't realized still festered. The validation of my experience from someone who had witnessed it firsthand was oddly more powerful than any DNA test result could be. 6 months after the revelation, I was promoted to vice president at my firm, the recognition based purely on merit rather than any attempt to impress absent parents. My relationship with Michael had evolved into genuine friendship, while Isabella and I were slowly rebuilding trust through painful honesty about the past and careful hope for the future. The most significant change, however, was internal. I no longer measured my worth against Harrison's impossible standards or sought validation from people incapable of providing it. My achievements belonged to me, my relationships were chosen rather than obligated, and my life was finally my own. The final piece of closure came at Thanksgiving when I declined Isabella's invitation to join the family gathering and instead spent the holiday with Michael and his family in San Francisco. For the first time in my life, I sat at a table where my presence was celebrated rather than tolerated, where my contributions were valued rather than minimized. "I'm proud of you," Michael said simply as we cleared dishes together. "Not for your job or your accomplishments, though those are remarkable. I'm proud of who you are, your resilience, your integrity, your capacity to choose healing over bitterness." The words I'd sought from Harrison for 32 years, freely given by the man who had contributed half my DNA but had never had the chance to know me, landed with profound healing force. They mattered because they came without conditions, without performance requirements, without the need to prove worthiness through external validation. That evening, as I reflected on the journey from that explosive family dinner to this moment of peace, I realized the most important truth. Family isn't defined by genetics or legal documents, but by those who see you clearly and love you anyway. The people who honor your authentic self rather than demanding performance of assigned roles. The luxury car I'd purchased as a desperate offering to earn approval had been reclaimed by Harrison through legal channels, then immediately sold, according to Camila's reports. The irony wasn't lost on me, even in retrieving his gift, as he'd chosen to erase rather than treasure it. But I'd gained something far more valuable: the understanding that my worth was never dependent on his recognition. A year after the revelation, I was featured in Financial Times as one of the rising stars of Wall Street, my innovative risk assessment models revolutionizing how investment firms evaluate market volatility. The article mentioned my education and career trajectory, but nothing about family connections or inherited advantages, because there weren't any to mention. The recognition was gratifying, not because it might impress Harrison, but because it represented achievement unburdened by the need for external validation. I'd finally learned to celebrate my own success without requiring anyone else's approval or acknowledgement. Harrison Sterling had given me one unexpected gift in 32 years: the motivation to become completely self-reliant, emotionally independent, and unshakably confident in my own worth. In trying to diminish me, he'd created the very strength that ultimately freed me from his influence. In withholding his approval, he'd forced me to find validation from sources that actually mattered. The DNA test had revealed more than paternity. It had revealed the path to authentic self-worth. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is permission to stop seeking love from those who will never provide it, and to start building the life you truly deserve. Have you ever discovered that the people who should love you unconditionally are the ones who hurt you most? Sometimes walking away from toxic family dynamics isn't abandonment, it's self-preservation. Your worth isn't determined by anyone's inability to recognize it. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear about your own journey towards self-acceptance. Sometimes the most important family we find is the one we choose for ourselves, built on mutual respect rather than obligation or expectation.